the neon sign of the Elm Street diner hummed a low, erratic note, buzzing like a trapped insect in the heavy pre-dawn silence. Inside, the air smelled heavily of burnt coffee grounds, stale grease, and the unmistakable scent of physical exhaustion. David sat on a vinyl stool that cracked under his weight, his forearms resting flat against the Formica counter. His skin was stained with a stubborn glaze of industrial grease and forklift soot that a 5-minute wash in the warehouse locker room could never fully erase. Every muscle in his neck throbbed from a 14-hour double shift at the logistics hub, a brutal routine of moving heavy crates to ensure wealthy people received their luxury goods on time, behind the counter. Martha moved, with the slow, deliberate rhythm of someone who had watched the same sunrise from the same window for 30 years. Her apron was faded, the floral pattern washed into obscurity, much like the dreams of most people who drifted into Elm Street at 4 a.m. She didn't ask David for his order. She simply slid a thick ceramic mug of black coffee toward him. She watched him for a long moment, her eyes tracking the deep, dark shadows carved beneath his lower lids. "You're running yourself into the dirt, son," Martha said softly, her southern drawl cutting through the silence of the empty diner. "A man can only bend so far before he snaps entirely." David didn't look up. He just wrapped his calloused, blistered hands around the warm mug, letting the heat seep into his stiff fingers. "The rent increased again, Martha. And Julianna's firm expects her to look a certain way. Silk blouses, designer shoes for the clients. Someone has to pay for the illusion." Martha sighed, a sound heavy with the accumulated wisdom of a woman who had seen 1,000 desperate men pass through her doors. She reached into the drawer beneath the cash register and pulled out a single silver scratch-off lottery ticket. It looked cheap, almost pathetic against the stark reality of David's mounting bills. "Take this," she said, sliding it across the counter until it rested against his coffee mug. "The universe owes you a break today, call it a hunch." David looked at the piece of cardboard and felt a familiar, cynical weight tighten in his chest. His father had always told him that luck was a trap designed to keep poor men waiting for a miracle, instead of working for a living. Hard work, sweat, and sacrifice were the only currencies that carried any real value in his world. He initially shook his head, reaching into his pocket to decline, but the sheer, crushing weight of his exhaustion made him relent. He didn't have the energy to argue. He handed over his last $5 bill, shoved the ticket deep into his grease-stained jacket pocket, and walked out into the cold morning air, forgetting about it before he even reached his rusted sedan. The day progressed, with the same grueling, unglamorous friction. By mid-afternoon, David was trapped in the warehouse breakroom, surrounded by the mechanical hum of vending machines and the smell of cheap microwave meals. It was a space designed for survival, not comfort. Pulling the ticket from his pocket, he used a rusted metal washer from his tool belt to scrape away the silver coating, fully expecting a row of mismatched symbols. Instead, the numbers aligned. Then came the row of zeros, clean and unblinking, preceded by a 5. $50 million. The silence that followed was louder than any engine in the facility. In that cramped, fluorescent-lit break room, the gritty atmosphere of his everyday struggle didn't vanish. It sharpened. The contrast between the grease on his hands and the staggering wealth on the cardboard was terrifying. The hard work hadn't saved him? A $5 piece of cardboard had. But as the adrenaline began to flood his veins, David couldn't have known that the slow, grueling burn of his morning shift was nothing compared to the emotional firestorm waiting for him at the end of the day. The wealth was real, but so was the betrayal that had been festering in the dark. While he was busy earning a living, the air inside the corner office of Vance & Associates felt heavy, suffocatingly still, and thick with the scent of expensive mahogany and betrayal. David stood just inside the threshold, the heavy glass door having swung open with a terrifyingly silent grace. Julianna remained leaning against the massive desk, her hand still resting on Marcus Vance's tailored shoulder. The intimacy between them wasn't frantic or nervous. It possessed the casual, settled comfort of a routine. When Julianna's eyes met David's, there was no sudden gasp, no tears of immediate regret. Instead, David watched her eyes instantly narrow into a cold, clinical assessment. Her mind was already running the numbers, calculating exactly how much he had heard through the cracked door and scripting her defense before the silence events and settle. David, she said, her voice dropping into that practiced, soothing register she used for difficult real estate clients. She stepped away from Marcus smoothly, smoothing the front of her silk blouse. You're early. This isn't what it looks like. Marcus and I were just under immense stress finalizing the quarterly portfolio details. The sheer audacity of the lie felt like a physical blow to David's chest. For 6 years he had pulled back-to-back shifts, destroying his health to fund her lifestyle, believing her ambition was for their future. Now, seeing her absolute composure, he realized she had never loved him. She had simply been using him as a stepping stone, until a wealthier option emerged. The emotional devastation was absolute, stripping David of his breath, leaving him entirely powerless in a room owned by her wealthy lover. He was just a warehouse worker in a dusty jacket, utterly defeated. Then, Julianna's gaze flicked past his shoulder, looking out the massive floor-to-ceiling windows toward the street below. Parked directly beneath the streetlights was the gleaming, metallic black Range Rover, its custom rims reflecting the city lights. A raw, unadulterated hunger flashed across her face. A sudden, fierce greed that she was entirely unequipped to hide. You bought that? She breathed, her voice losing its calculated calm, replaced by a sudden desperate fascination. How did you afford that? Before she could take another step toward him, the smartphone tightly gripped in David's hand began to vibrate violently. He didn't answer it normally. With a numb, deliberate motion, he pressed the screen and hit speakerphone. Mr. Reynolds, the professional, crisp voice of the state lottery director echoed with piercing clarity in the quiet office. This is a formal courtesy confirmation. The initial wire transfer of $50 million has successfully cleared our security protocols and has been deposited into your private account. Congratulations, again, sir. The words hung in the air like a sudden drop in barometric pressure. The shift in power was instantaneous and total. Marcus Vance's aristocratic arrogance vanished. His jaw dropped slightly as he looked at David with a sudden, panicked realization that this man could now buy his entire firm. But it was Julianna's face that provided the true climax. The color drained from her cheeks so fast. She looked ghost-like under the fluorescent lights. The mathematical horror of her mistake hit her with the force of a train. She had spent months plotting an exit strategy for a corporate partner's lifestyle, only to realize she had abandoned absolute, unimaginable wealth right at the finish line. David, she gasped, her voice cracking as she rushed forward, her hands reaching out to grab his jacket. The cold calculation was entirely gone, replaced by raw, frantic panic. David, please, look at me. I was confused, I was under so much pressure. We can go home. We're a team, we've always been a team. David stepped backward, letting her fingers grasp empty air. The trapping of her own greed was complete. She wasn't mourning the loss of her husband. She was mourning the loss of $50 million, and they both knew it. The scratch-off ticket lay flat on the stained breakroom table, resting between a half-eaten bag of cheap chips and a dented metal lunchbox. David stared at the numbers through a haze of physical exhaustion. He didn't look like a man whose life was about to change. He looked like a man who had been thoroughly beaten by the daily grind. His uniform was stiff with dried sweat, and his knuckles were scraped raw from unjamming a conveyor belt earlier that afternoon. But under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights, the silver latex film had been scraped away to reveal a sequence that defied logic. $50 million, the exactness of the number felt heavy, almost violent in its precision. In the world David inhabited, money was measured in small painful increments. The price of a gallon of gas, the late fee on a utility bill, the $20 left over after buying groceries. $1,000 was a windfall? $10,000 was a distant dream, but $50 million was an entirely different species of reality. It was an astronomical, life-altering sum that completely obliterated the rules of his existence in a single heartbeat. At first, the sheer scale of the number caused a strange, suffocating panic. His heart hammered violently against his ribs, and the air in the cramped breakroom felt suddenly thin. $50 million meant he never had to step foot inside this cavernous warehouse again. It meant the crushing weight of debt that had kept him awake at 3:05 a.m., for the last 5 years, was permanently dissolved. It meant freedom, power, and absolute security. The classic, intoxicating allure of the rags-to-riches dream had materialized right in front of his eyes, turning a desperate worker into a multi-millionaire before his shift was even officially over. But as the initial shock began to settle into a cold, sharp clarity, David realized the money wasn't just a ticket out of poverty, it was a magnifying glass. A sum that massive acts like a catalyst, speeding up hidden realities and forcing people to reveal exactly who they are when survival is no longer an issue. He thought of Julianna, sitting in her pristine downtown office, constantly dropping subtle hints about the wealth of her clients, the neighborhood she wished they could afford, and the limitations of his meager salary. For years, he had accepted her criticisms as motivation, believing that if he just worked harder, pulled more overtime, and sacrificed more of his health, he would finally be enough for her. Now, holding $50 million in his grease-stained hand, the dynamic had completely flipped. The economic imbalance that had defined their marriage, the subtle, humiliating sense that he was as underperforming as a provider, was shattered. He was no longer the struggling husband trying to catch up to her corporate ambitions. He held the kind of generational wealth that her entire firm spent decades trying to secure. The question that kept his fingers trembling as he pocketed the ticket wasn't about what he would buy first. It was about how the people around him would react when the illusion of his poverty vanished. $50 million had instantly raised the stakes of his entire life, turning his quiet, desperate marriage into a high-stakes arena where loyalty, greed, and deception were about to collide at absolute full speed. The heavy silence inside the corner office was punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic ticking of a high-end wall clock. David didn't offer a dramatic speech, nor did he unleash a torrent of furious accusations. Instead, the entire weight of the confrontation localized itself into the physical space between three people, anchored completely by two luxury items that transformed a standard marital argument into an undeniable grimy scene of the heart. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass panel behind Marcus Vance's desk, the city below was rapidly losing its daylight. Parked directly against the curb, bathed in the sharp, artificial glare of the street lamps, sat the metallic black Range Rover. It was immaculate. The deep gloss of the paint reflected the neon signs of downtown, and the custom rims caught the light with an expensive, aggressive shine. It was a physical manifestation of Julianna's ultimate desire. The exact vehicle she had pointed out in luxury magazines. The status symbol she claimed defined a person's worth in the corporate world. It stood outside like a monument to David's devotion, purchased with the very first drop of his sudden wealth. But inside the office, looking down from the window, that vehicle became something entirely different. It became a mirror reflecting Julianna's absolute superficiality. Her eyes were locked onto it, her pupils dilated with a raw, undeniable hunger that completely betrayed her words of panic. She wasn't looking at David, she was looking at the car. The visual contrast was devastating. The husband standing in a faded jacket, offering the world, while the wife stared through the glass, calculating the cost of the metal outside. The vehicle was no longer a gift, it was the physical proof of her greed, captured perfectly under the streetlights for anyone to see. Then, David slowly reached into his pocket. He didn't pull out a legal document or a phone to show evidence. He withdrew a small, heavy designer bag and pulled out the square, midnight blue velvet box. Inside was the 3-carat, emerald-cut, diamond ring she had taped a clipping of to their bathroom mirror 2 years ago, a piece of jewelry he had spent months feeling guilty for not being able to provide. With a movement that was terrifyingly calm, David didn't hand it to her. He didn't drop it at her feet. He tossed it carelessly across the polished mahogany of Marcus's executive desk. The box slid across the dark expensive wood with a soft, scraping sound that felt incredibly loud in the quiet room. It spun once, striking the corner of Marcus's silver fountain pen and a leather-bound planner, before coming to a complete rest directly in front of the lover's chest. The deep blue velvet looked stark, almost violent, sitting on the desk of the man who had been sleeping with his wife. That single motion condensed years of sacrifice, late nights, and unrequited loyalty into a single piece of discarded luxury. The ring, which should have symbolized a lifetime of commitment, was now sitting on another man's desk, physically separating the cheaters from the man they had betrayed. It was a visual execution of the marriage. By leaving the ring there, David didn't just end the conversation, he recontextualized the entire room. Marcus was left staring at a piece of jewelry he didn't buy. Julianna was left staring at a fortune she could no longer touch, and the physical objects remained behind as permanent artifacts of a betrayal that no amount of smooth corporate lies could ever erase. The fluorescent lights of the high-rise office cast a stark, clinical glow over Julianna, illuminating her not as a woman caught in an emotional mistake, but as a corporate strategist whose biggest merger had just catastrophically collapsed. Julianna had always prided herself on her ability to manage risk. In her eyes, marriage was never a romantic sanctuary. It was a long-term financial portfolio. For 6 years, she had assessed David as a bad investment, a low-yield asset who worked grueling warehouse shifts and brought home nothing but exhaustion. She had calculated the trajectory of his life and concluded that his ceiling had already been reached. Her affair with Marcus wasn't born out of sudden, overwhelming passion. It was a cold, calculated upward trajectory. Marcus represented the lifestyle she felt she deserved. The downtown, penthouse, the executive networking circles, and the social currency that David's calloused hands could never provide. She had spent months carefully plotting her exit strategy, waiting for the precise moment when the quarterly bonuses would hit, so she could maximize her financial departure. She had run the numbers 1,000 times in her head. Leaving a poor man for a wealthy executive was, to her analytical mind, simple mathematics, but Julianna's fatal flaw was her inability to account for the unpredictable variables of fate. As the voice of the lottery director crackled through the speakerphone, confirming the staggering sum of $50 million sitting in David's private account, the look on Julianna's face wasn't one of heartbreak. It was the frantic, terrifying expression of a day trader watching the market crash in real time. Her eyes darted from David's calm, detached expression to the metallic black Range Rover idling at the curb below. In a fraction of a second, her internal ledger shattered. The catastrophic irony of her self-sabotage hit her with physical force. She had spent months executing a high-risk betrayal to secure a comfortable, upper-middle-class corporate lifestyle, with Marcus, completely blind to the fact that absolute, generational wealth was waiting for her just a few weeks away. She had abandoned genuine, unwavering loyalty right at the absolute finish line. If she had just waited, if she had just maintained the illusion of the faithful wife for one more month, $50 million would have been legally hers to share. "David, please," she stammered, stepping forward as her mind frantically tried to recalculate a winning strategy out of absolute ruin. Her hands trembled, reaching for his faded jacket, trying to deploy the old emotional manipulation tactics that had always worked on him before. "You know me. I was just stressed. I was confused by the firm's pressure. We built everything together. We can't throw away 6 years over a misunderstanding." But the words sounded hollow, even to her. The calculated opportunist had been thoroughly outmaneuvered by reality. David looked down at her hands, his eyes devoid of the anger she expected. Anger she could work with? Anger meant he still cared, which meant he could still be manipulated. This cold absolute silence was a dead end. She looked back at Marcus, who was now staring at the 3-carat diamond ring resting on his desk like a piece of radioactive material. Marcus looked small now. His executive title, his tailored suit, his country club membership, everything she had traded her soul to acquire, suddenly looked pathetic compared to the astronomical fortune David now held. Julianna was trapped completely by her own greed, left standing in the wreckage of a brilliant plan that had proven to be her ultimate undoing.